Her husband called and demanded a divorce, laughing. When she returned home, he was on his knees. The conference room was buzzing with conversation when the phone vibrated on the table. A woman glanced at the screen and saw her husband's name flashing. Expecting the usual small talk, she stepped outside to answer. But the moment she pressed the phone to her ear, her stomach dropped. His voice was cold, detached, and carried a smugness that made her uneasy. "I'm divorcing you," he said, as if announcing a casual decision. Then, with a cruel chuckle, he added, "And I've already sold the house. Hope you enjoy finding a new place." The words hit like a slap. For a few seconds, she stood frozen in the hallway, gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. "You sold the house?" she asked, keeping her tone neutral. Her husband, Daniel, laughed again. "Yeah. I got a great deal, and Nicole and I need the money to start fresh. She deserves better than that old place anyway." Nicole. The name burned through her like acid. She had suspected something for months, the late nights, the unexplained absences, the sudden disinterest in their home life. But hearing it confirmed, hearing him speak so casually about replacing her, was something else entirely. There was no sorrow, no hesitation. Just arrogance. He had already moved on, already built a new life, while she had been obliviously holding on to a marriage that was nothing but a facade. "Sounds good," she said after a moment, making sure her voice carried no hint of emotion. She refused to give him the satisfaction of hearing her break. Silence stretched between them, as if he was waiting for a reaction, some plea for explanation or a desperate outburst. When none came, he scoffed. "Guess you took that better than I expected. Well, good luck, sweetheart." Then the line went dead. She stood there for a long moment, the cold weight of betrayal pressing against her ribs, suffocating her. But as the shock subsided, something else took its place, a strange, quiet certainty. He thought he had won. He thought he had left her with nothing. But Daniel didn't know everything. And that was going to be his downfall. Sitting through the rest of her meeting was nearly impossible. Her mind kept circling back to the call, to Daniel's smug tone, to the utter confidence in his voice. He truly believed she was powerless, that he had stripped her of everything. But what he had overlooked, what his arrogance had blinded him to, was the fact that the house was no longer in his name. Months ago, during a refinancing process, she had taken full ownership of the deed. Daniel had signed the paperwork without a second glance, trusting her to handle the details, too lazy to read the fine print. And now, that carelessness was going to cost him. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to focus on the present. There was no use reacting emotionally. If she wanted to turn the tables, she needed to be meticulous, strategic. So instead of breaking down, she called her lawyer, Olivia, the moment she returned to her hotel room. Olivia answered on the second ring. "Tell me everything," she said after listening to the brief summary of what had happened. The moment she heard that Daniel had sold the house without consent, her tone sharpened. "He's an idiot. That sale is void. You own the property outright. If the buyer has already transferred money, Daniel just committed fraud." The word fraud sent a shiver of satisfaction through her. "So what do we do?" she asked, gripping the phone tightly. Olivia's answer was immediate. "We notify the buyer. If the sale has already gone through, Daniel is on the hook for the damages. He'll be legally required to return the money or face serious consequences." For the first time since the call, a sense of control returned. Daniel thought he had humiliated her, but in reality, he had just set himself up for the worst kind of downfall. The flight home felt like the longest of her life. With each passing mile, her anger simmered, controlled but relentless. She envisioned Daniel in their house, her house, living out his fantasy of a fresh start, blissfully unaware that it was all about to collapse. She kept her expression calm as she stepped off the plane, her heels clicking against the polished airport floor. Olivia had already handled the legal matters, ensuring the buyer knew the transaction was invalid. All that was left was to confront Daniel and watch his arrogance crumble. She pulled into the driveway, gripping the steering wheel as she took in the sight of the house. Lights glowed from inside, and laughter drifted through an open window. A woman's laugh. Nicole. The audacity made her stomach twist, but she forced herself to stay composed. With a deep breath, she stepped out of the car, walking up to the front door with purpose. She didn't bother knocking. She used her key, her house, after all, and pushed the door open. Inside, Daniel was standing in the living room, holding a champagne glass. Nicole was curled up on the couch, draped in one of the silk robes she had left behind. When they saw her, their laughter stopped. Daniel's face twisted in confusion before it turned into a smug grin. "I figured you'd come crawling back sooner or later," he said, swirling the champagne in his glass. "But you're a little late. I already sold." "You didn't sell anything," she cut in, her voice steady. She pulled out a manila folder from her bag and tossed it onto the coffee table. "Because the house was never yours to sell." Daniel frowned, setting his glass down. "What the hell are you talking about?" "Read it," she said simply. Nicole, sensing the tension, shifted uncomfortably. Daniel grabbed the folder and flipped through the documents. As his eyes scanned the papers, the color drained from his face. His hands trembled slightly as realization dawned. This isn't possible," he muttered. "Oh, but it is," she said, watching him unravel. "You signed the papers yourself. You handed the house over to me months ago, Daniel. And now, you've just committed fraud." The room was silent, save for the rustling of papers in Daniel's shaking hands. Nicole shot up from the couch. "You told me you had everything under control," she hissed at him. "You said this house was yours." For the first time, Daniel had no clever retort, no smug laughter. Just raw, unmistakable panic. Daniel's grip on the documents tightened, his knuckles turning white. His eyes darted over the fine print, desperately searching for some loophole, some way out of the mess he had unknowingly created. But the truth stared back at him in cold, black ink. His signature was right there, final and indisputable. He had signed away ownership of the house months ago, too arrogant and careless to read what he was agreeing to. His jaw clenched, his throat bobbing as he swallowed hard. The silence in the room was suffocating. Nicole, still wrapped in her stolen luxury, turned to him with narrowed eyes, her previous admiration for his supposed power flickering into doubt. "You lied to me," she hissed, stepping away from him as if betrayal was contagious. "You told me you owned this place. That you had everything set up for us." Her voice was shrill now, her manicured fingers trembling as she pointed at him. "Did you even get any money from the sale? Or did you just scam some poor buyer into thinking they were getting a deal?" Daniel ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. He had already spent a large portion of the deposit, new furniture, expensive gifts for Nicole, a down payment on a luxury condo. The reality hit him like a freight train. If the sale was invalid, then he owed back every penny. And worse, he had committed fraud. Daniel slammed the folder shut and turned to face his wife, his usual charm and bravado absent. "This is a mistake," he muttered, shaking his head as if sheer denial could reverse reality. "I'll fix it." But there was no fixing this. Nicole scoffed, stepping away as she folded her arms. "Fix it? How, Daniel? You don't even own the house. You just sold something that wasn't yours to sell. Do you know what that makes you?" The weight of her words settled over him, and for the first time, true fear flickered in his eyes. He turned back to his wife, the woman he had so carelessly discarded, and found her standing tall, composed, completely in control. "You should start packing," she said, her voice calm, detached. "Both of you." Daniel blinked, his face contorting in confusion. "What?" His voice cracked slightly. She leaned forward, her lips curling into the faintest hint of a smirk. "This is my house. And I have no intention of letting a squatter stay here any longer." Nicole gasped, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows shooting up. "Squatter?" she echoed, the insult cutting deep. Daniel's shoulders squared, his pride momentarily flaring. "You wouldn't dare," he growled. "Oh, but I would," she replied smoothly. "And legally, I have every right." Daniel stormed toward her, his fists clenched at his sides. "This is still my home," he snapped, his voice rising in desperation. "I lived here, paid for things," she cut him off with a short laugh, shaking her head. "Paid for things?" She gestured around the lavishly decorated room, a stark contrast to the growing tension. "With what, Daniel? My salary? My investments? Because as I recall, I was the one who kept this household running while you played businessman." Her words sliced through his ego, leaving him raw and exposed. Nicole, meanwhile, was staring between them, realization dawning. "You're actually broke, aren't you?" she whispered, horror creeping into her voice. Daniel shot her a warning glare, but it was too late. The truth was unraveling faster than he could control. "Oh my God," Nicole continued, her voice rising. "That's why you sold the house. You needed the money." She let out a humorless laugh, shaking her head. "And you dragged me into this mess." Her disgust was palpable, and for the first time, Daniel looked smaller, his confidence draining with every passing second. His wife stood unshaken, her arms crossed as she observed him, waiting for the reality to fully sink in. A heavy silence filled the air as Daniel struggled to formulate a response. His once impeccable ability to manipulate, to twist situations in his favor, was useless here. There was no denying the evidence, no smooth words that could undo the consequences of his arrogance. He turned back to his wife, his expression shifting from fury to desperation. "We can work something out," he said quickly. "I mean, come on, we built this life together." She tilted her head, her eyes studying him as if he were a stranger. "No, Daniel," she said, voice even. "I built this life. You just coasted along, thinking you could take whatever you wanted." Nicole, still fuming, grabbed her purse and turned toward the door. "I'm not sticking around for this disaster," she snapped. "Call me when you figure out how to fix your mess." The front door slammed behind her, leaving Daniel standing alone in the wreckage of his choices. He turned back to his wife, the only person who had ever truly supported him, and for the first time in years, he felt vulnerable. "Please," he said, his voice quieter now, stripped of arrogance. Don't do this. She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. You already did this to yourself, she replied, before walking past him and heading toward the staircase. Daniel sat on the couch, staring blankly at the now closed door. The weight of his situation pressed down on him, suffocating. His mind raced with potential solutions, but every path led to disaster. He had spent the deposit, he couldn't return the money, and the buyer would soon realize they had been scammed. His phone buzzed violently on the table, breaking the silence. He grabbed it with trembling hands and saw an unknown number flashing on the screen. Hesitantly, he answered. Daniel, a stern voice said. This is Patrick Reynolds. I was the one who purchased your house. His stomach twisted into knots. Listen, I think there's been some miscommunication, he started, but Patrick cut him off. Save it, he snapped. Your wife's lawyer reached out to me. The sale was fraudulent. You can't sell a house you don't own. So now you have exactly 48 hours to return my money before I take legal action. The blood drained from Daniel's face. He opened his mouth to argue, but the line went dead. Slowly, he lowered the phone, his grip slack. He had been so certain of his own invincibility, so sure that everything would work out in his favor. But now, reality had caught up to him. Daniel stood abruptly, pacing the room as his thoughts spiraled. His entire life had been carefully curated to project success, to mask the cracks that had been forming beneath the surface for years. He had always believed he was untouchable, that his charm and quick thinking could get him out of anything. But charm wouldn't undo fraud. Quick thinking wouldn't return the money he had already spent. And his wife, his greatest asset, was no longer on his side. He swallowed hard, running a hand over his face. Upstairs, he heard the faint sound of drawers opening and closing. His wife was packing. The reality of it settled deep in his gut, heavier than anything he had felt before. He had taken everything for granted, her patience, her trust, her unwavering support. And now, she was done. He could feel it in the air, in the finality of her movements. Desperation clawed at his throat, but he forced it down. He needed to act fast, to find a way out. But deep down, he knew the truth. There was no way out. Daniel's breaths came short and uneven as he paced the living room, his mind clawing for a solution. He had always prided himself on his ability to talk his way out of problems, but this wasn't some minor issue he could smooth over with charm. Fraud. The word echoed in his mind, heavy and final. He had sold a house that wasn't his, spent money that didn't belong to him, and now, with the buyer demanding repayment, the walls were closing in. His fingers trembled as he unlocked his phone and checked his bank account. The numbers on the screen made his stomach churn. There wasn't nearly enough left to cover what he owed. Upstairs, the sound of zippers and rustling fabric signaled that his wife was still packing. It sent a deep, gnawing fear through him. He had always assumed she would be there, that no matter what happened, she wouldn't leave. Even when their marriage had soured, even when he had stopped putting in the effort, she had remained. But now, she wasn't just leaving him, she was stripping away the safety net he had taken for granted. He couldn't let her go, not when everything was falling apart. He ran up the stairs 2 at a time, bursting into the bedroom. She barely glanced at him as she folded a blouse into her suitcase. "We need to talk," he blurted. She didn't stop packing, didn't even pause. "We've talked enough," she said simply, her voice devoid of emotion. Daniel swallowed hard. "Come on," he tried, forcing a chuckle that sounded hollow. We've been through worse than this." That made her stop. She turned, her expression unreadable, though something flickered in her eyes, something dangerously close to contempt. "Have we?" she asked, tilting her head. "Because I don't recall you ever committing fraud before." His mouth opened, but no words came. She shook her head, zipping up her suitcase. "I'm done, Daniel. You used me, you lied to me, and now you want my help cleaning up your mess?" His hands curled into fists, panic rising in his chest. "I can fix this," he insisted. "I just need a little time." "Maybe we can talk to the buyer," she cut him off with a bitter laugh. "We? No, Daniel. You need to fix this. I have nothing to do with it. And I won't be sticking around to watch you sink." The finality in her voice sent ice through his veins. He had always assumed he could manipulate her, charm his way back into her good graces. But this time, she wasn't playing his game. He watched, helpless, as she lifted her suitcase and walked past him. She didn't even look back. The door slammed shut, leaving Daniel alone in the bedroom. The silence that followed was deafening. He stood there, unmoving, staring at the spot where she had just been. It didn't feel real. She was gone. Really gone. He staggered back, dropping onto the edge of the bed, his hands gripping his hair. His entire life had unraveled in less than 24 hours. He had lost his marriage, his home, his money, everything. A deep, sinking dread settled in his stomach. This wasn't just a setback. This was ruin. And if he didn't act fast, things would only get worse. His phone buzzed, shattering the silence. His heart pounded as he glanced at the screen. It was the buyer again. He hesitated before answering. "Daniel," the man's voice was sharp, unforgiving. "You have 24 hours to return my money, or I press charges." Daniel's throat went dry. "Listen, I just need a little more time." No, the buyer's voice was like steel. "You don't get time. Either I get my money, or I get a lawyer. Your choice." The call ended before he could respond. Daniel lowered the phone slowly, staring at it with a mix of disbelief and terror. He had run out of options. And the clock was ticking. Daniel stood abruptly, his mind racing. He needed money fast. The only thing he could think of was calling in favors, but his list of allies was short. Most of his so-called friends had been drawn to him for his perceived wealth and influence. Now that he was exposed as a fraud, he doubted any of them would lift a finger to help. Still, he had to try. He scrolled through his contacts, his pulse hammering. The first call went straight to voicemail. The second was answered with a curt, "I can't help you, man." By the fifth rejection, his stomach was in knots. No one wanted to be associated with him now. He threw the phone onto the couch, rubbing his temples as a wave of frustration surged through him. If no one would lend him the money, he had only one option left. He had to find a way to delay the buyer. He didn't know how, but he'd figure something out. He always had. Pacing the room, he muttered to himself, running through possible lies, schemes, anything that could buy him more time. But deep down, he knew the truth. He wasn't in control anymore. And for the first time in his life, he felt real, paralyzing fear. Daniel barely slept. By morning, he looked at his reflection in the mirror and barely recognized himself. His usual confidence, his carefully curated charm, it was all gone, stripped away by the harsh light of reality. He forced himself to get dressed, ignoring the anxiety clawing at his gut. He needed a plan. But as he grabbed his phone, it buzzed in his hand. He frowned, glancing at the screen. It was an unknown number. Hesitantly, he answered. "Daniel," a familiar voice sneered. It was his former boss. "I heard you're in a bit of a situation." Daniel's blood ran cold. News had spread. People were talking. He could almost hear the amusement in the man's voice. "I gotta say, it's impressive," his boss continued. "You always acted like you were untouchable. Guess we all know the truth now." A cold sweat broke out on Daniel's skin. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he snapped, trying to keep his voice steady. His former boss only chuckled. "Sure. Keep telling yourself that." The call ended, leaving Daniel gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles ached. He had been humiliated before, but never like this. And he knew this was only the beginning. Daniel sat motionless on the couch, gripping his phone with numb fingers. His former boss's words echoed in his mind, a sharp reminder of just how quickly his life had unraveled. He had spent years cultivating an image of power and success, convincing everyone, including himself, that he was untouchable. But now, the cracks in his illusion had widened into gaping holes, and the world was watching as he fell. He had no job, no home, no money, and now, no allies. His carefully constructed life had turned to dust, and the humiliation was only beginning. His stomach churned as he forced himself to stand. He needed to get out of the house, clear his head. He stepped outside, only to freeze in place. Across the street, his neighbor, Mrs. Langley, was standing on her porch, arms crossed. Her sharp eyes locked onto him, lips curled in a smirk. Well, she drawled. "Didn't think I'd see you around here after what happened." Daniel's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, she continued, "Heard your wife kicked you out." "Can't say I blame her. You always acted like you were better than the rest of us." Her laughter rang out as she turned and walked inside, slamming the door behind her. Daniel's fists clenched as he stood on the porch, heat rising to his face. His entire neighborhood knew. The people he had once dismissed as insignificant were now reveling in his downfall. His instinct was to lash out, to defend himself, to remind them that he had once been the most successful man on the street. But that was a lie now, and everyone knew it. With a deep breath, he stepped off the porch and started walking, his mind swirling with desperation. He needed money. He needed to fix this. But with every step, reality pressed in, he had no way out. His feet carried him to a familiar place, the cafe he used to frequent back when his life was intact. As he entered, the barista barely spared him a glance. He reached for his wallet, only to remember he had canceled his credit cards in a desperate attempt to control his dwindling finances. His fingers curled into his empty pockets, and a new wave of humiliation washed over him. "Daniel?" a voice called. He turned and felt his stomach drop. It was Greg, an old acquaintance, one of the many people Daniel had brushed off in the past. Greg's eyes gleamed with amusement. "Heard about the mess you're in," he said, sipping his coffee. "How's that working out for you?" Daniel forced a smirk, trying to mask his growing panic. "I'll be fine," he lied, shrugging as if his entire world wasn't crumbling. Greg raised an eyebrow. "Right. Well, if you need work, I might be able to put in a word for you. Entry-level stuff, though." The words stung. Daniel had once been the one offering opportunities, the one people sought out for favors. Now, he was reduced to begging for scraps. His pride warred with his desperation, but in the end, his pride won. "No thanks," he muttered, turning to leave. Greg only chuckled. "Suit yourself." As Daniel stepped back onto the street, the weight of his situation pressed down harder. He had no job prospects, no money, and no place to stay. His wife had locked him out of his own home, his former friends had turned their backs, and even casual acquaintances saw him as nothing more than a cautionary tale. The reality was undeniable. He was completely, utterly alone. He needed to think, needed to come up with something, anything, to stop the downward spiral. But deep down, he knew the truth. There was no way out of this. As Daniel wandered aimlessly, his phone buzzed again. His stomach tightened as he saw the buyer's number flashing on the screen. Hands trembling, he answered. "Daniel," Patrick's voice was colder this time, less patient. "It's been 24 hours. Where's my money?" Daniel's mouth went dry. "I just need a little more time," he stammered, his voice cracking. "I can get it, no more excuses," Patrick cut him off. "I've already spoken to my lawyer. If I don't have my money by tomorrow morning, I'm pressing charges. You'll be dealing with more than just a lawsuit." The line went dead, leaving Daniel in suffocating silence. He swayed slightly, his heart pounding. Fraud. Lawsuit. Prison. He had spent his life believing he was invincible, that the rules didn't apply to him. But now, he was on the brink of losing everything, not just his money, but his freedom. He needed to act. Fast. But how? His mind raced, grasping at ideas, but every solution ended in the same dead end. There was no easy fix. No escape. And for the first time, the weight of his choices pressed down on him in full. As night fell, Daniel found himself back in front of his own house, staring at the darkened windows. He had spent the last few hours calling every contact he could think of, but no one was willing to help. His desperation had reached a fever pitch, and now, standing in front of the place he once called home, he realized just how far he had fallen. He had nowhere else to go. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward and knocked on the door. A long silence stretched before the lock clicked, and the door swung open. His wife stood there, arms crossed, eyes unreadable. "What do you want, Daniel?" she asked, her voice cold. His throat tightened. "I need a place to stay," he admitted, hating the words even as he said them. She let out a sharp breath, shaking her head. "No. You don't live here anymore." The finality of it hit him like a punch to the gut. "Please," he tried, but she stepped back, her face hard. "You made your choices, Daniel. Now live with them." The door closed, locking him out for good. Daniel sat on the curb outside his house, staring blankly at the pavement. The night was cold, the street eerily quiet. He had never felt more alone. Just days ago, he had been on top of the world, convinced he had everything under control. Now, he had nothing. No home. No money. No allies. His own wife had shut him out, and tomorrow, he would face legal action that could end with him behind bars. He ran a hand through his hair, his mind exhausted. There was no grand escape, no clever trick to fix this. For the first time in his life, he was powerless. The realization settled heavily in his chest, suffocating him. He had spent so long believing he could outmaneuver any situation, but this time, there was no way out. He had played the game and lost. And now, there was nothing left to do but face the consequences. Morning arrived with an unforgiving chill, seeping into Daniel's bones as he sat slumped against the cold brick wall of a closed cafe. He hadn't slept. His mind had been a relentless storm of fear and regret, each thought more suffocating than the last. As the sun rose, so did the weight of reality. Today was the deadline. If he didn't return the buyer's money, the legal wheels would start turning, and this time, there would be no escaping the consequences. His phone buzzed in his pocket, the sound making his pulse spike. Slowly, with trembling fingers, he pulled it out. A new email flashed on the screen, notice of legal action. His breath caught as he skimmed the message. The buyer had wasted no time. The lawsuit was already in motion, citing fraud, breach of contract, and financial damages. The legal jargon blurred in his vision, but the meaning was clear. He was about to be dragged into court, forced to answer for his lies. His hands clenched around the phone. He had never truly believed it would come to this. He had spent his entire life bending the rules, talking his way out of problems, manipulating situations to his advantage. But now, there was no one left to manipulate, no words that could undo the mess he had created. This was real. And for the first time, Daniel felt the crushing certainty of his own downfall. Desperation clawed at his throat as he stumbled to his feet. There had to be a way out. He could still fix this, he had to. His feet carried him through the city, his mind racing with possibilities. He needed money, and there was only one person left who might be willing to help. His brother. They hadn't spoken in years, not since Daniel had made it clear that he considered himself superior, too important to waste time on family obligations. But now, pride was a luxury he couldn't afford. He pulled out his phone, hesitating only for a moment before dialing the number. The line rang once, twice, before a familiar voice answered. "Daniel?" His brother's tone was cautious, guarded. "Hey," Daniel forced a weak laugh, trying to mask the panic in his voice. "Long time, huh?" There was a pause, then a sigh. "What do you want?" Daniel swallowed hard. "I need a loan. Just temporary. I'm in a bit of a situation." Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken history. Then, finally, his brother let out a dry chuckle. "A situation? You mean the fraud case?" "Yeah, I heard about that." Daniel's stomach dropped. "Listen, No, you listen," his brother interrupted, his voice sharp. "You burned every bridge you had, Daniel. You used people, you lied, and now you're paying for it. You made your bed, now lie in it." The call ended. Daniel stood frozen, his heart pounding in his ears. He was truly, completely alone. The rejection stung, but he had no time to dwell on it. As he walked aimlessly, his phone rang again. His lawyer's name flashed on the screen. His stomach twisted, but he forced himself to answer. "Daniel," Olivia's voice was tense. "We need to talk. The buyer isn't playing around. You need to prepare for court." He exhaled shakily, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "What are my options?" A sigh came through the line. "Bad ones. You don't have the money to settle, and if this goes to trial, you're looking at criminal charges." Daniel's blood ran cold. Criminal charges. That meant prison. That meant losing everything. There has to be something I can do, he pleaded. Olivia hesitated. If you can gather any funds, even a partial payment, we might be able to negotiate. But he had nothing. No assets. No savings. No allies. I'll figure something out, he said quickly, though he had no idea how. He ended the call and kept walking, barely aware of his surroundings. It wasn't until he heard the murmurs that he realized where he had wandered, to a busy downtown plaza. People were staring. Whispers spread like wildfire. Some even pulled out their phones. That's him. The guy who scammed someone out of a house. A group of men in business suits snickered as they passed, one of them shaking his head in mock pity. From luxury to the streets, huh? One of them mused. The humiliation burned through him, searing and inescapable. He had spent his life looking down on people, acting as if he were untouchable. Now, he was nothing more than a spectacle, a cautionary tale unfolding in real time. As the whispers continued, he turned away, shoulders hunched. His pride had been shattered piece by piece, but nothing compared to what happened next. Just as he rounded a corner, he saw her, Nicole. Dressed impeccably, standing outside a cafe, laughing with a man he recognized instantly. Patrick Reynolds. The buyer. The man suing him. His pulse spiked as he watched Nicole place a hand on Patrick's arm, her signature flirtatious smile playing on her lips. Rage and disbelief twisted inside him. Nicole, the woman he had thrown everything away for, the woman he had left his wife to be with, was cozying up to the very person responsible for his legal downfall. Had she planned this? Had she always known? As if sensing his gaze, Nicole turned her head and met his eyes. For a brief moment, something flickered across her face. Guilt? Amusement? He couldn't tell. Then, slowly, she smirked. And just like that, Daniel understood. She had moved on. She had never cared. And she had left him to rot the moment he was no longer useful. The betrayal snapped something inside him. He stormed toward them, his breath ragged, his vision tunneling. You, he growled, pointing at Nicole. She arched an eyebrow, feigning surprise. Daniel, she said smoothly. You look rough. Patrick simply sipped his coffee, watching with detached amusement. How long? Daniel demanded, voice shaking. How long have you been playing me? Nicole sighed, shaking her head. Oh, Daniel. Always so dramatic. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. Did you really think I'd tie myself to a sinking ship? Patrick chuckled. You really should have read the fine print, he said mockingly. Actions have consequences. Daniel's hands clenched into fists. He wanted to scream, to lash out, to demand justice. But there was nothing left to fight for. He had lost. Everything. He turned on his heel and walked away, the sound of their laughter ringing in his ears, each step heavier than the last. The courtroom was cold, sterile, and filled with the quiet murmurs of people waiting for the proceedings to begin. Daniel sat stiffly at the defendant's table, his palms clammy against the polished wood. His lawyer, Olivia, flipped through her documents, her expression unreadable. Across from him, Patrick sat with his own attorney, calm and composed, his confidence unwavering. The contrast between them couldn't have been clearer. Just months ago, Daniel had been the man in control, the one others feared or respected. Now, he was nothing but a desperate man trying to avoid the full weight of the law crushing him. The judge entered, and silence fell over the room. The case was straightforward. Daniel had sold a house that legally wasn't his, took the money, and spent it recklessly. There was no defense. Olivia did what she could, arguing that Daniel had made an error in judgment, that there was no malicious intent. But Patrick's lawyer countered with cold, hard facts. The defendant knowingly engaged in fraudulent activity, the man stated. He misrepresented his legal ownership of the property and financially harmed my client in the process. Daniel could barely breathe as the judge listened, nodding slowly. He already knew what was coming. He just didn't know how bad it would be. The judge's voice was steady, firm, devoid of sympathy. Given the evidence presented, this court finds the defendant, Daniel Carter, guilty of fraud. He is ordered to repay the full amount owed to the plaintiff, plus additional damages for the distress caused. Daniel's stomach dropped as the final number was read aloud, a sum so impossibly high he felt his vision blur. There was no way he could pay it. No way to fix this. The judge continued, her tone unwavering. Furthermore, as the defendant has shown a reckless disregard for legal and ethical responsibilities, this court sentences him to a 6-month period of incarceration. The words hit him like a physical blow. He heard gasps ripple through the small audience. Even Olivia seemed momentarily frozen. But Patrick? Patrick smirked. Nicole, who sat in the back, whispered something to him, and they both laughed. The sheer humiliation burned through Daniel, hotter than any fire. He wanted to protest, to beg, to demand another chance. But there was nothing to say. The gavel struck, finalizing his fate. Olivia placed a hand on his arm, but he barely felt it. The guards approached, and for the first time in his life, Daniel realized what true helplessness felt like. The cell was small, gray, and suffocating. The mattress was thin, the air stale, and the walls seemed to press in on him from all sides. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, staring at nothing, his mind replaying the last few months like a broken record. This was it. This was what he had been reduced to. No wealth, no power, no control. Just a number in a system, a man who had lost everything because of his own arrogance. He had always thought he was smarter than everyone else. That rules didn't apply to him. That he could take what he wanted without consequences. And now, here he was, stripped of every illusion he had built. The days passed in a monotonous blur. The food was tasteless, the routine rigid, the stares from other inmates a constant reminder that he was no longer above anyone. He had once looked down on people in situations like this, convinced that only fools and failures ended up here. And yet, he had become exactly that. Worse, he had done it to himself. As he lay awake one night, staring at the ceiling, a realization settled in his chest like a weight too heavy to move. No one was coming to save him. Not his former friends, not Nicole, not even his family. He was truly, utterly alone. Outside the prison walls, life continued without him. His wife flourished, her career thriving now that she was free from his manipulations. She had taken full ownership of the house, renovated it, and built the life she had always deserved. Word had spread about Daniel's downfall, but instead of sympathy, people only shook their heads. He had burned too many bridges, mistreated too many people. There was no one left who mourned his absence. Even Nicole, who had once draped herself over him like a trophy, had disappeared from his life entirely. She had moved on to someone wealthier, someone smarter. The news of her engagement reached him through an overheard conversation between guards. A businessman, well-connected, with a fortune that made Daniel's past wealth look laughable. He should have been angry. Should have felt betrayed. But instead, all he felt was emptiness. He had given up everything for her. Risked his marriage, his finances, his reputation. And in the end, she had discarded him as easily as he had discarded others. It was poetic, really. He had spent his life using people, and now, he was the one left with nothing. Just another forgotten name in a system that didn't care. The day of his release came with no fanfare, no warm welcome. He stepped out of the prison gates, a bag of belongings in one hand, the cold wind biting at his skin. There was no car waiting for him, no friendly face. Just the vast emptiness of a world that had moved on without him. He had no money, no job, no place to go. He had spent years believing he was invincible, only to end up like this, a man stripped of everything, forced to start from nothing. He turned, glancing back at the prison, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. A part of him realized that he had belonged there. That his punishment had been deserved. With slow, heavy steps, he walked down the street, unnoticed by the people around him. He was no longer the man who commanded attention, no longer someone anyone feared or admired. He had lost everything. And the worst part? He knew he had no one to blame but himself. His ex-wife, wherever she was, had won. She had escaped him, built a life he could never touch again. And Daniel? Daniel was just another failure, a cautionary tale whispered in high society circles, a reminder that arrogance and greed always come with a price. And in his case, it was a price he would be paying for the rest of his life.